Episode W, The Word of Wisdom Exposed. Part 1, The Truth Behind the Word of Wisdom. The temperance movement was in full swing by the late 1820s, and its influence is undeniable in the so-called revelation of the Word of Wisdom. Long before Joseph Smith's 1833 pronouncement, health publications and societal leaders were already advocating for the very principles he would later claim came from God. In fact, Simplicity of Health, 1829, outlined nearly every recommendation later found in the Word of Wisdom: avoidance of alcohol, coffee, tea, tobacco, sparing use of meat, and eating fruits in season. Another work, Means of Preserving Health, 1806, covered it all, abstaining from intoxicants and tobacco, limiting meat, and focusing on seasonal fruits. By the time the Journal of Health was published in Philadelphia on August 25, 1830, these ideas were far from new, and they were clearly shaping public opinion. Closer to home, the Kirtland chapter of the Temperance Society was established in 1830, shortly before the Mormons arrived from New York. Presbyterian minister Sylvester Graham, famous for his rigorous health teachings, led a speaking tour from the late 1820s until 1840, preaching abstinence from alcohol, smoking, tea, coffee, and promoting a grain-heavy diet with locally sourced fruits and vegetables. Meat was strictly forbidden. Graham was widely known, even giving us the graham cracker, and his ideas mirrored the exact health guidelines that would later appear in the Word of Wisdom. The notion that Joseph Smith delivered some groundbreaking divine revelation on health falls flat when stacked against these well-established social movements. It's important to note that these health movements weren't just on the fringe. They were part of the national conversation, permeating cities, towns, and even rural America. These principles were not foreign to the Smith family either. With ministers like Sylvester Graham dominating the dialogue, it becomes clear how intertwined these ideas were with Joseph's later revelation. The overlap is more than coincidence. It's a direct reflection of contemporary influences. By the time Joseph Smith received the Word of Wisdom, the temperance movement was already a powerful force across America. February 26, 1833, just one day before Smith's revelation, marked the National Day of Temperance, stirring significant discussion in places like Nauvoo. At the School of Elders, men chewed, spit, and smoked tobacco, while the women, including Emma Smith, were left to clean up after them. Frustrated, Emma reportedly remarked that it would be a good thing if a revelation could be had, declaring the use of tobacco a sin and commanding its suppression. The men, in jest, suggested that any such revelation should also ban tea and coffee to needle the women further. Then, as if on cue, Joseph Smith unveiled his revelation on February 27, 1833, a perfect mirror of the temperance rhetoric circulating in the nation. There was nothing divinely groundbreaking about it. Smith simply formalized what was already being debated in homes and halls across the country. He lifted the very language of the temperance movement and used it to end a domestic squabble, wrapping it up as a commandment from God. The Word of Wisdom was not a divine foretelling of modern health principles. It was a convenient appropriation of the social trends of the day, molded to serve the needs of Joseph and his inner circle. LDS leaders claim Joseph Smith received divine foresight in his Word of Wisdom revelation, but the truth is much more complicated. Found in D&C 89, this revelation was never intended as a commandment. It was presented as guidance, good advice, not divine law. The original text didn't even prohibit beer or wine, only hard liquor, and it was certainly not meant to determine who could enter the temple. It wasn't a measure of worthiness, nor was it used to divide the faithful from the less devout. The first 3 verses of today's D&C 89, which state, "not by commandment or constraint," were initially just an introduction. Somehow, in the 1876 edition of the Doctrine and Covenants, this introduction got absorbed into the body of the revelation itself and was canonized without ever being offered to the general membership for common consent, despite the fact that such a step is required for Scripture to be ratified by the body of the saints. After the revelation was given, nearly all Mormons continued drinking alcohol, and the advice to eat meat sparingly was ignored, just as much then as it is today. In fact, wine was served at the dedication of the Kirtland Temple. Some even speculate that the wine was spiked with hallucinogenic mushrooms, which supposedly inspired the mass visions seen at that event. Visions that were never experienced before or after. The idea that alcohol would eventually be forbidden didn't even enter the conversation until much later. And it wasn't just the average Mormon ignoring the word of wisdom. Joseph Smith himself installed a bar in his Nauvoo mansion and, using his power as mayor, passed a law making it the only legal place in town to buy alcohol. When Smith and his companions were locked in Carthage jail, they requested wine to lift their spirits before their deaths, something that is conveniently left out when discussing Smith's so-called martyrdom. His personal journal even records him drinking a glass of beer on June 1, 1844. That entry was conveniently omitted by the church when they published the history of the church in 1906, desperate to maintain their sanitized narrative. Brigham Young wasn't much different. He owned a distillery in Salt Lake City, which the church leased from him, further proving that, for a time, no one really seemed to believe that God cared about the consumption of alcohol, tobacco, coffee, or tea. In truth, these revelations appear more like convenient responses to Emma Smith's complaints than any divine mandate. The modern LDS Church's strict health code, promoting total abstinence from alcohol, tobacco, coffee, and tea, claims to be divinely inspired. However, the reality is far more nuanced. Few Mormons today realize that health codes, like the Word of Wisdom, were widely discussed throughout the 19th century. Smith's revelation was not unique. In fact, it's no coincidence that the American Temperance Society's National Day of Temperance took place just one day before Joseph Smith's Word of Wisdom was revealed. The language of the revelation mirrors the public discourse of the time, almost word for word. Even the avoidance of hot drinks originally referred to the temperature of the drink, not its content. Coffee and tea were only later targeted. In the years following Smith's revelation, it wasn't treated as a commandment, but as a mere suggestion, one that was largely ignored by prophets and members alike. They continued to drink, operate distilleries, and profit from alcohol distribution in Utah. The reference to barley drinks in the Word of Wisdom clearly allows for mild beers, but this is frequently overlooked, with many Mormons wrongly assuming it refers to postum, a coffee substitute. Even the advice to eat meat sparingly, which could be seen as an early nod toward the rise of vegetarianism in the mid-1800s, is often ignored. Ironically, while modern Mormons pat themselves on the back for following the Word of Wisdom, they tend to neglect the actual text. Today, the LDS Church owns the largest cattle ranch in the United States, a fact that makes the "eat meat sparingly" directive even more ironic, especially when paired with the church's aggressive promotion of its health code. Part 2, Presenting a Farce. Joseph Fielding Smith, apostle and church historian, once addressed the question of when the Word of Wisdom became a commandment, and his response has long been accepted as the official explanation. In his widely read Answers to Gospel Questions, Smith wrote, September 9, 1851, President Brigham Young stated that the members of the church had had sufficient time to be taught the import of this revelation, and that henceforth it was to be considered a divine commandment. This was first put before the male members of the congregation, and then before the women, and by unanimous vote accepted. However, a closer look at 19th century diaries, sermons, and personal accounts reveals a different story, one that paints Smith's interpretation as revisionist at best. The original text of the Word of Wisdom, beginning at what is now the 4th verse, gave no indication that it was a commandment, let alone a binding one. Instead, it was framed as advice, a word of wisdom by revelation, meant to serve as a guideline. Those who followed this advice were promised health and great treasures of knowledge, but it was clearly not a law intended to separate the obedient from the unfaithful. The irony in all of this is that Joseph Smith himself, the very prophet who supposedly received this revelation, was known to enjoy alcohol throughout his life. While in Kirtland, he drank regularly, and in Nauvoo, he went so far as to install a bar in his own home. As mayor of Nauvoo, Smith even passed a law making his home the only legal establishment for purchasing alcohol in the town. If the Word of Wisdom had truly been a commandment at the time, how could Joseph justify not only drinking but also selling alcohol? The answer is simple. It wasn't a commandment at all, just advice, and Joseph, like many others, wasn't willing to give up his drink. Joseph's indulgence wasn't just a private affair. Many accounts from Kirtland, Nauvoo, and even Carthage highlight the frequency with which he drank. From his documented glass of wine at Carthage jail to his public beer consumption, Smith wasn't just bending rules. He was setting a tone that alcohol wasn't really off limits, despite his own revelation. This behavior trickled down to the leadership that followed him. Brigham Young and other LDS leaders followed suit once they arrived in Utah, operating distilleries and liquor stores. The church's later strict enforcement of the word of wisdom as a commandment only underscores the flexibility with which its leadership treated these divine revelations when it suited their own interests. The transformation of the word of wisdom from sound advice to a rigid law was a move of convenience, shaped more by economic and social pressures than any divine mandate. Part 3. Let it flow in Utah. Leonard Arrington, the LDS Church's own historian, didn't mince words in his work, An Economic Interpretation of Word of Wisdom. He laid it all out, showing how Brigham Young twisted Joseph Smith's good advice into a binding commandment, and it had nothing to do with divine revelation. The reason? Cash. Arrington explained how Brigham Young enforced the word of wisdom to prevent money from flowing out of Utah. By restricting luxury imports like tobacco, tea, coffee, and alcohol, Young ensured that precious cash stayed within the territory. In truth, it wasn't about holiness, it was about control. Young didn't offer any new revelation to back this move. He simply disregarded Joseph's original guidance and instead focused on keeping the Utah economy afloat. Coffee and tobacco weren't just temptations to the faithful. They were seen as threats to the church's financial power. The real kicker? The word of wisdom wasn't even added to temple recommend questions until 1921, when the need to secure members' loyalty took precedence over the earlier financial motives. The hypocrisy went deeper. On October 7, 1873, George A. Smith, a member of the First Presidency, openly admitted, "We are doing a great business in tea, coffee, and tobacco in the cooperative store." These items were not banned, but rather sold by the church itself, lining its pockets while preaching temperance. The church-controlled Zion's Cooperative Mercantile Institute, ZCMI, monopolized the liquor trade for years. The Salt Lake Tribune exposed this, reporting that the Mormon leadership resisted Gentile-owned liquor stores, not because they opposed alcohol, but because the Gentiles were getting the business. The Tribune didn't stop there, pointing out the hypocrisy of the church. This fierce effort to retain the liquor traffic here as a monopoly of the church was quite in accord with the present status of affairs, where the church is running the biggest liquor business in the state. ZCMI and Apostle Reed Smoot's Provost store were raking in huge profits from liquor sales while claiming moral superiority as advocates of temperance. The church leadership, including President Joseph F. Smith, who was also the president of ZCMI during its alcohol selling days, pocketed the rewards of liquor sales while preaching against it. This wasn't about a misunderstanding of the word of wisdom. It was about money and power, plain and simple. The church didn't just promote temperance. They exploited the liquor trade, all while pretending to be champions of moral virtue. Critics saw through this charade over a century ago, and the evidence speaks volumes. This was less about God's will and more about the church's bottom line. Historians have unearthed countless accounts of church leaders turning a blind eye to their own teachings. Heber C. Kimball openly admitted to drinking tea, while the church-owned distilleries in Utah continued operations well into the 1870s. The divide between what was preached and what was practiced by the leadership casts a shadow on the supposed divinity of the word of wisdom. In the end, the word of wisdom wasn't a divine revelation. It was a product of the 19th century temperance movement, shaped by social trends and later exploited for economic and political gain. In Utah, Brigham Young used it to keep money from leaving the territory, restricting imports like tobacco, tea, coffee, and alcohol to maintain economic control. Meanwhile, the church profited from selling those very products, proving that the enforcement of the word of wisdom had more to do with power and profit than spiritual guidance. Far from being a unique insight, it became a tool of control, molded to fit the needs of Joseph Smith and the leaders who followed. Thank you so kindly for watching. This is the Ex-Mormon Informant signing off for today.